Is MVVM a bad architecture for a SwiftUI app? There's no question that MVVM has been a particularly popular architecture for iOS apps over, we could say, the past decade. I myself have used it more than once and I've always been quite happy with it. However, for the past year and maybe a bit before that, I've seen more and more people start to question whether or not MVVM is as relevant as it used to be in the context of SwiftUI. So I wanted to talk about this topic for some time, and as it happens, I found an article recently that after I read it, I found myself agreeing with maybe 80% of the content of the article. So I was like, this is perfect to finally talk about this topic in video. So first, I'm gonna start by recapping the content of the article. As always, if you want to read the article in full, you have the link in the description. So the article begins by making the argument that while MVVM was indeed a very popular pattern for UIKit with good reason, it does not necessarily mean that it is also as relevant for SwiftUI. There are a few arguments. The first one, I must say, is the one that I agree the least with, which is the fact that Apple does not advocate for MVVM in WWDC videos. That's true, but Apple also did not advocate for MVVM back in the days of UIKit in their WWDC sessions. So I don't think it's the best argument. Apple has always been quite light when it comes to architecture. And I think even this year, there is at least one video that I remember that did mention a view model. But let's move on because the next arguments are the one that I agree with much more. So the first argument that I agree with a lot is the fact that in SwiftUI, it's quite easy to write the full UI logic in a view. And by UI logic, I mean from fetching the data to presenting it on the UI and handling user interaction. Here you can see a view that can handle a loading, an error, and the loaded state. It's able to do it because SwiftUI has this nice switch syntax that you can use inside the body of a view. If you wanted to do the same thing in UIKit, it would require much code, but it's not the case in SwiftUI. And in a view in SwiftUI, you can also use the nice property wrappers like @state and @environment that, anyway, only work inside of the view. So, for example, you cannot use @environment inside a view model. If you want to do it, you will find yourself like fighting the framework quite a bit. Then the next argument for not using view models is that view models are traditionally used to encapsulate the business logic of the app, but you can also do that in SwiftUI through the environment because the environment is a nice way to inject dependencies across the view hierarchy. And typically, if you have specific objects that handle specific parts of your app where there is a lot of business logic, so think of things like authentication, networking, this kind of thing, you can inject it into the environment and then each view can retrieve these specialized objects. And in a way, these objects can play the role of some kind of a view model, not exactly a view model because authentication, there isn't necessarily something to show on the UI, but this kind of like classes that encapsulate a logic and that you want to keep that logic outside of the views because that logic is not view related. Then the next argument is that if you need to implement some kind of logic in the view, you can do it easily directly inside the view in SwiftUI without the need of having the code in a view model because you have modifiers like on, change, off, which allows you to define a closure that will be called whenever the value of an state or an environment property changes. You also have the modifier task with the ID parameter, which allows to trigger a task whenever the value of the ID changes. So that allows you to implement kind of like reactive pipelines where code will be triggered in response to a change in the model. And you can do all of that inside of the view itself. And so when you take all of that, you can argue that it's possible to split the code of a SwiftUI app across three different, we could say like domains. You have the models that represents like the business of your app, the business objects of your app. So for example, in a social media app, like the example in this article, it would be the posts, the social media post and everything that goes along with them. You would also have there the business logic, For example, things about formatting, maybe about searching, filtering, things like that. Then you'll have the services, which will allow your app to interact with the outside world. So think of things like network clients, databases, utilities. So the services could also mean things injected through the environment, and they will be mostly actually injected through the environment according to what the article is arguing for. And then you have the views, which are pure representations of the state, and they orchestrate user interaction in the sense that they handle the loading, they handle the user tapping on an item, they handle the user doing a pull to refresh, doing a search, all of these basic user interaction. And then one more argument that the author has for using views directly and not view models is that if you take frameworks designed specifically with SwiftUI in mind, like the Swift Data Framework, well, if you try to use a view model to fetch your data, you're gonna end up adding a lot of extra code, making the developer experience worse, and even opening the door for potential bugs. And that's because the basic building block of the Swift Data Framework is the @query annotation, which can only be used inside a view, just like @environment and @state. And so if you try to create a view model instead of using @query, you will end up basically having to write a lot of boilerplate code, kind of like if you try to use UIKit instead of SwiftUI. And so, in conclusion, the point that the author is making is that with the current state of SwiftUI in 2025, there is no need to use view models. You can directly have your business logic inside services and then handle everything inside the view. So, what's my personal opinion on this topic? I'd say first you need to remember why MVVM became so popular with iOS. The reason is that back in the days of UIKit, you needed to write a lot of code just to make your UI work. Think, for example, of setting up a collection view or a table view. That requires quite a bit of code just to make the dequeuing logic of the cells work. And same thing for something as simple as a button. If you wanted the state of a button to be correctly enabled and disabled when it made sense, that could end up in having quite a lot of code across your view controller. So when you already need a good amount of code just to make the UI work, well, if you add on top of it more code to fetch data and make it ready to be presented, that ends up with a view controller that has a lot of responsibilities, and it was better to split it into two different types: the view model that took care of fetching and preparing the data, and then a view controller whose sole responsibility was making sure that the UI worked correctly. Additionally, with SwiftUI, it's quite easy to split a view into several child views, but with UIKit, even though it was possible to split a view controller into several child view controllers, using child view controllers was never super popular, and the main reason was that from a developer point of view, it was not great. There were a lot of issues to make subtle bugs if you forgot to call the right method to have the lifecycle of the sub-child view controllers be correctly handled. And so that just made it way harder to split a big view controller into several smaller ones. And it was way easier to split the logic between view controller and view model. But with SwiftUI, things are completely different. If you want to display a list in SwiftUI, you just use the list view, you pass it a closure for how to build each of the rows in the list, maybe you set a few modifiers for the style, and that's it. So much less code is required in order to make the UI work. In addition, the body property makes it so that the view is really a function of the state, which enables nice syntaxes like the use of a switch inside the body like we saw just before. And when you take that into account, it makes sense to question the relevance of a view model with SwiftUI, because the reason for which view models were introduced, the fact that there was a lot of code just to make the UI work, is no longer the case in SwiftUI. And indeed, I agree with the author that if your UI logic is simple enough that you're handling something basic, and by basic, I mean displaying a loader, having a pull to refresh, having an error view with a button to retry, and maybe a search bar, then indeed, it's possible to implement everything in the view on the condition that you are still properly encapsulating the business logic of the model inside the services. Typically, if you start doing some formatting, some filtering, some sorting inside the view, that might be a bit too much. But if that code is put properly into the services, then using the services directly inside the view does make total sense in SwiftUI. And that brings me to the reason why I wanted to make this video, because now it's time to talk about how do you choose the architecture for your iOS app and what is a good architecture. Personally, when it comes to architecture, I like to use this definition. So let me read it so that I don't make a mistake. Architecture is how we choose to organize our code in a way that best serves our current goals. And the reason why I like this definition is because it highlights the fact that architecture is always relative. What is a good architecture today might not be a good architecture tomorrow because your goals might have changed in the meantime. For example, if you're a startup just getting started, you still haven't found your product market fit, your goal is probably to ship things fast in order to get user feedback. That's very different than if you're working on a team of 20 engineers where you need to make sure that developers can collaborate efficiently and that it's easy to onboard new developers onto the team. So how do you choose which architecture to use for your iOS app? Well, if we use the definition I just gave, then you can argue that the best choice for an architecture is the simplest way to organize our code in a way that best serves our current goals. And the emphasis here is on simplest. So what I mean by that is that you should only add complexity if it solves an actual problem. If you're able to implement your SwiftUI app using the approach showed in this article without using a view model, then that's great. And the question of whether or not a view model is relevant doesn't even make sense because there is no problem to solve. So why think about introducing this extra layer of complexity? So really, to conclude this video, my best advice when it comes to choosing an architecture is to be super pragmatic and try not to be dogmatic. It's very easy to become dogmatic. For example, MVVM was the go-to solution, and so it's very easy to use MVVM as a default approach, even though it might not make sense. I would say use what is the simplest to solve your current goals, and then as new problems arise, as new challenges arise, well, you can revisit your choices and add extra layers of complexity. There are some very complex architectures out there. One example would be the RIBS architecture from Uber. I think no one in their right mind would think about using this architecture if you're just starting a new project and you're testing a few ideas. Such a complex architecture makes sense, however, if you are Uber and you need to operate with lots of engineering teams distributed across several engineering leaders, maybe even operating across several time zones, and you need all of these people to collaborate efficiently on the same code base. Completely different problem than an indie developer that is just starting a new project and wants to get early feedback from its users. And before we end this video, I want to show you a piece of code that is quite interesting and that's at the end of the article. So it's not code that works. It's like what the author would like to see integrated to SwiftUI. And same thing, I would love to have this possibility. And it's to have a macro at observable with environment, which would allow you to say this observable class is going to work always with this view. So typically, this is going to be the view model of my view, and it will always be installed on my view. And because there would be this constraint, it would be possible to use the @environment property wrapper inside this class, even though it's not a view, because there is the guarantee that it will always be used inside a view. Unfortunately, it does not exist yet, but if it were to exist, it would completely change like the way that SwiftUI work. And so at this point, it would make sense to reconsider. And if there was such a macro, maybe then arguing for an view model by default would make again more sense, because it would become super easy to split code across the view and the view model. There would be no need to fight the framework. And so the debate would change. And the reason I wanted to mention it to finish is that it's yet another example of it's important to stay open and not be dogmatic. If things change in SwiftUI next year, well, some decisions might need to be revisited. So to conclude, I would say, does it make sense not to use a view model in SwiftUI? Yes, if it works for you. If you like to use view models, then you should also keep using them. Maybe you still find value with them. The one reason why I would say maybe view models are bad is if using a view model means that you need to actively fight the framework, fight SwiftUI, fight Swift data. In that case, you might want to reconsider, because the ultimate goal is to be able to ship features fast and reliably. If you end up losing a lot of time and creating potential for bugs because you're fighting the framework, that's not serving any of these two goals. And that's it. This time it's the end of the video. As always, I would be super curious to know your point of view on this topic. If you've stopped using MVVM and why, if you're still using MVVM and why you think that it still brings value. Whatever your point of view is, please write it in the comments. I would love to read it. As always, if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss the next ones. Thank you for watching and see you next time.